Identifying and removing bias from artificial intelligence. I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Susan Etlinger. She is an industry analyst at Altimiter. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Great to be here.
What kind of work does Altimiter Group do?
So we are part of a company called Profit, which is a brand strategy firm. And Profit does all sorts of stuff around customer experience, brand and design, growth acceleration. And we at Altimeter focus on research. So we look at the technologies that are affecting business, particularly large enterprise, and trying to unpack them for business readers. So particularly business audiences, leadership. So we look at things like leadership, artificial intelligence, the future of digital transformation, all that kind of stuff.
What does smart, well-considered, and ethical use of data look like?
So, in the last several years, and, you could actually go back even further, we've been just dealing with this influx of data from everywhere. And, one of the things that we see on a regular basis are these news stories about places where people's data was compromised, either through a breach or just kind of an unanticipated or unexpected use of data. And so it's important for businesses to kind of balance two things. One is the need for innovation, the need to be able to use data to inform products and services and actually new business strategies. And then the other is not to use data in such a way that it surprises or disenfranchises or excludes people, whether they're customers, patients, citizens, you name it.
What are the ethical risks of artificial intelligence?
So there are a number of different things. So when you think about ethics, which the word actually usually makes people back away from me slowly, it really, philosophically, it really has to do with norms of behavior. So behavioral norms that we, all sort of generally understand in our day-to-day lives, and maybe we always follow them and maybe we don't. In the digital world, there aren't really these norms. And so you see things happening on Twitter that, people saying things to each other that they would never probably say in real life. What's happened with artificial intelligence is now we've added sort of an autonomous, self-learning set of technologies to technologies that we already had, and it can start to compound errors or biases or other things that we see sort of in the physical world. So, one of the issues around ethics is to be really clear when we're moving interactions from an analog or physical space into a digital space. Are we aware and are we watching for some of those unanticipated consequences? And are we actually creating processes and practices such that we, that we avoid them?
Describe what you mean by bias in AI. What are some of the possible social and economic implications of artificial intelligence tainted by bias?
Sure. So, bias, from a kind of data science standpoint, just means that you have a specific intention around looking at some data, and sometimes there's unanticipated or unexpected bias that pops in. So, for example, if you're looking at, let's say a retail e-commerce site, and you're trying to look for sweaters, your bias is to look for sweaters, not for pants. That's fine. However, there are ways that bias can kind of have a social and sometimes even economic and physical impact on people, which is that algorithms absorb all of the biases that we have in society. So things like racism, sexism, issues around religion, political affiliation, disability, gender, what have you. And so some of the types of things we've seen happen are around things like the criminal justice system, where people of color are disproportionately swept up into the criminal justice system. And all the algorithm knows is that, a certain group of people are more likely to have a particular outcome. And so essentially what it does is it compounds that interaction or compounds that relationship such that it makes some very uncomfortable and some very incorrect and painful and harmful associations.
Should we be able to opt in to the data being collected on us?
Well, in the European Union, this is actually already possible, right? So there's a set of laws in the European Union called General Data Protection Regulation, and they essentially came out of the UN Declaration of Human Rights back from believe it was 1948, after the Second World War. And the point was that, in a time where you have a history of data being used to discriminate against people, they wanted to make sure that people could opt in and that people could have more control. We don't really have that, that kind of legislation here, although arguably we're sort of, big companies are subject to it if they're global. So, I think from a customer experience standpoint, it's important for companies to think about the data rights implications and the sort of experience that customers have with us as brands.
What has been the so-called Facebook effect on trust?
So, in some sense, the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica issue is it's sort of a double-edged sword. And in the sense that it's a good thing because it raised awareness of the types of ways that algorithms can be weaponized for a particular outcome. And if you can imagine sort of weaponizing an algorithm to, potentially, sway an election, you can imagine weaponizing an algorithm to discriminate against people or to actually fight with another country or another social system. So like it can get, it gets really, really painful really fast when you think about it. So the good news is that it sort of raised consciousness about how algorithms can have this impact. The bad news is that not all companies are Facebook, right? So if you're a retail bank or you're a e-commerce company or you're a department store or big box retailer or an airline, your issues around data and data use are very, very different from Facebook's. But there are some lessons to be learned there about treating people's data with respect, especially given the fact that more and more we have services and products that are almost entirely related to data and almost entirely based on data.
How does empathy and respect find its way into the AI? Who are the data scientists that are actually even tackling the challenge?
Yeah, so, when you think about empathy, this is not like, oh, I understand your feelings, let's talk about your feelings. This is really about thinking, and a lot of like user experience designers would say, this is kind of what we've been doing from day one, folks, which is to try to think about what is the experience that the person on the other end of the product or service is going to have. And so when you think about empathy, for example, in the context of like a voice agent like Alexa or Siri or Google Home, part of empathy is you want to have a voice agent that understands the way they speak. So if they have an accent, a dialect, if they speak African American vernacular English, if they, if English or whatever the language being spoken is not their first language, they have a disability, you want to be able to have a system that hears everybody. And so that's a really fundamental aspect of what empathy would look like and respect would look like in a voice agent scenario. Another one would be that when you're talking to that little tubular thing on your desk, you don't know what it knows and you don't know what it knows about you. And so it may need to have reminders or ways of reminding you that, hey, Tonya, last time you were halfway through this interaction about, to buy a plane ticket, do you want to pick that up now? Or I just transferred this money. Are you sure you want me to transfer it again? Because you don't have the same clues that you do on a screen that show you that you have, completed a transaction, that you've gotten a confirmation, those kinds of things. So those are just two examples.
How do we test data sets for bias? And how can leaders ensure that their data sets and artificial intelligence aren't tainted?
Yeah, so, I think we have to expect that all data sets are going to come with some measure of bias because that's just the human condition. And there have been a number of papers. There's one very well-known paper called Man is to Computer Programmer as Woman is to Homemaker that was actually written in 2016 by some researchers from Microsoft Research and Boston University that actually looked at ways to de-bias data sets. There are many, many data scientists and researchers working on these issues all over the world right now. They're publishing papers not only on language bias, so for example, assuming that every woman is a homemaker and every man is a programmer, but also images that, bias in images. So for example, any person standing in a kitchen is a woman. So there's actually a paper called Men Like Shopping Too, which is about the fact that, when you look at computer vision, if all it knows, or most of what it knows, is women standing in kitchens, it's going to assume that that next person standing in a kitchen is a woman. And clearly that's not how the world works.
Susan Etlinger, industry analyst at Altimiter, thank you so much for your time and shedding some light on bias and AI. If somebody wants to connect with you, maybe they want to find out more about your work, how can they do that?
Yeah, a few different ways. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find there. I'm on Twitter at @setlinger, or you can email me at susan@altimitergroup.com.
Thanks again. And if you want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or maybe by going to my website, tonyahall.net. I've got links to all my social sites. Thanks for watching.